Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your family's story with more than 500 million digitized newspaper pages from the 1690s to today. Search for obituaries, marriage and birth announcements, photos, and more in papers from across the U.S., the U.K., Canada, and beyond, stretching back 3 centuries. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription. Just use the code Genealogy Adventure at checkout. That code is Genealogy Adventure for 20% off Publisher Extra.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. How are you today? Hey, Brian, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you crystal clear.
Okay, good. Because I just realized I don't have my headphones.
Neither do I.
No, but thank you so much for joining us today, guys. This is going to be an awesome show as we do our second show in the Celebrate Freedom series in honor of Juneteenth.
And as always, we really appreciate you spending the next hour with us, however you're watching or listening. And I'm just going to get right into it because I find this subject really fascinating. So today we are joined by Alan Hoilman, and he's been the curator for the Hampton History Museum since May 2016. Previous to this, he was also the curator director of exhibits and collections from the Virginia Air and Space Center, which is fascinating, which is located in Hampton, Virginia. Before coming to the Basque, Alan served as curator of political and socioeconomic history of the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he worked on numerous exhibitions. He has served for over 30 years in the museum profession. Alan has lived in the Old Wythe neighborhood of Hampton since 2000. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're very excited to have you.
We are so pleased to have you on the show, and one of the reasons why we chatted about in the green room. Normally, when we have guests come on the show, Donnie and I usually spend Saturday and Sunday just kind of surfing through YouTube just to get some more background information on the subject. And there's hardly anything about Black beaches or Black resorts, apart from, Idlewild, like the really big, famous ones. But Black beaches in particular don't seem to get much of a mention, and I'm curious to get your thoughts as to why that is.
Well, I think as many African American stories are, they're pushed away from the mainstream audience for one reason or the other. The Black beaches themselves began to disappear in the 70s, so they're not as fresh in the consciousness of the culture as they might be. But again, African American stories are often just left untold by the mainstream.
And again, I find it really interesting because it's almost as though African Americans have been divorced from a history of anything to do with bodies of water. So that's ignoring the fact that there were mariners, sailors, canalmen, obviously all up and down the Gullah Geechee coast, people were, there were boatmen, fishermen.
Well, that's a stereotype that we have to work to correct. Certainly here in Hampton, which is a city in and of the water, the African American presence was from the beginning. There were pilots, there were oystermen. They worked, they played on the water just like their white contemporaries from the beginning. Our great seafood industry was largely harvested by African American watermen. So they're there. They have always been there, and we've just got to pick up on the stories.
Just like the myth that Black people don't swim. Well, I surf, I swim, and I sail. Donia, you swim, don't you?
I used to be a lifeguard.
And that's right.
I float really well.
Yeah, I actually used to be a lifeguard. But it's not just being divorced from the water. It's being divorced from our history period. I mean, there's so many stories out there about African Americans that's not told. And it's amazing. It's just amazing that the number of stories, like from one, like Brian said, we do research on Saturdays and Sundays on our shows just to give us a fresh take on it. And so when I did some of my research on this particular show, they're literally only talking about 6 of the Black beaches that are still in existence today, one of which is in Martha's Vineyard. That's Oak Bluff. So I'm like, what's the number of Black beaches during that time? You can't find it.
To nail it down in detail would be difficult because they kind of organically sprang up to serve their community, and they may well exist for a couple of seasons and then move to another location. But I think in large part because of the way that entire industry came to a close, it's actually a more difficult story to engage than you would think, because it was not a happy, successful ending for most Black beaches, and a great irony in why that came to be.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to eventually cycle around to the story that broke either this year or the end of last year about a Black family that owns a beachfront property in Los Angeles, who they basically just got it back. But I want to start at the origin story. So, Alan, in terms of your research, kind of when is the earliest iteration of what could be classed as a Black beach?
Well, in fact, Bayshore is among those. Bayshore is among the very earliest that we've been, maybe the earliest that we could identify, and that was 1890s. Now, again, African Americans working and playing on the seashore, this certainly existed. But it was in this time that the Jim Crow laws began to really tighten the grip on who could be where. And it's at this point that the necessity arose, and African Americans just kind of rose to the challenge, took control of the situation, and said, okay, if our lives are limited in this way, we're going to carve out a place for ourselves where you can't limit our access and our enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. What was the risk of an African American family going to a segregated beach that wasn't designated for them?
Once the notorious laws of 1912 were passed in Virginia, that formally segregated, they would expect a cold reception before. Once formally segregated, starting in 1912, you would be arrested. You would be arrested and removed.
What would be the charge?
The charge would be trespassing, or charges of. I mean, these were Virginia laws, so you would be in a place where you were not allowed to be. A public accommodation, you were not allowed to be. You could be trespassed off the property, and you would also find. Even I don't have any specific examples, a violent reaction to African Americans arriving at segregated beaches, but there was always the implication that violence is a resort here. If we choose for you not to be here, we will remove you if you're not removed by the police. Mm-hmm. One of the odd kind of turns of history is during this period, right after the turn of the century, segregation became much more dramatically encoded. So where there were previously unofficial cultural boundaries, beginning as they began to pass these Jim Crow laws in the early part of the 20th century, right through the codification of it in 1912 in Virginia, it became a more and more segregated world in this area.
So I guess going back to the time of segregation, I've been struggling trying to think of how I want to frame this question. So there's a beach that locals have discovered. This is the segregation period. Was there a quality or a characteristic to the beach that would lend it to be used more by whites than blacks? Kind of what was the difference between, obviously in terms, apart from the racial designation as to what beach would be used by white people and what beach wouldn't?
Well, it's interesting that Bayshore and Buckrow Beach, which are Hampton's two beaches, actually developed and evolved in parallel, almost along the same timeline. That part of Hampton had been a fishery ground. It's where you would drag your nets and your boats up on the beach. It wasn't considered a playground at all. But they did develop the concept for Buckrow as an entertainment location, and almost at the same, just a few years later, Bayshore evolved very organically. I don't think in its original conception by Frank Banks, who was a Hampton University official, that he thought of it as a reaction to a segregated beach. He had this vision in his mind of just a place where visitors to Hampton Institute or Hampton Institute students could go enjoy the seashore, could exercise, and it just kind of organically arose. Now it became more politically important for its existence after 1912. So it had, a 20-year span where it was really an enclave for Hampton Institute. And it began to develop amenities for the folks from the university, now the university, while Buckrow was developing amenities for entertainment.
Now, the other thing I'm really interested in, and it's the Virginia Memory website in particular that springs to mind. I'm used to seeing those kind of 1940s, 1950s postcards advertising a beach.
Mm-hmm.
You see, glamorous young people frolicking and having fun, or like young families. And you see those for the white beaches. I have yet to find one for an African American beach. Have you ever seen like postcards?
We have a collection. We have a number of them, of the images on exhibit here now that actually do the same kind of advertising for Bayshore that you would have found in the Buckrow Beach postcard. So absolutely. And that's, one of the reasons I try to bring to the fore that Bayshore was evolving in parallel with Buckrow, and was as attractive to the visitors there, and was as well known. It showed up in the Green Book. People along the East Coast knew there was a Bayshore and knew to come here, and people would come from as far north as New York and Boston to visit Bayshore because it was an agreeable place to be.
So was Bayshore owned by a family?
It was owned by a corporation. It was founded by a corporation, started in I'm trying to remember the exact date. I believe it was 1897. A parcel of land was purchased by an investment group led by Frank Banks, Robert Moten, who was then at Hampton Institute and became the president of the Tuskegee Institute, and a local African-American businessman, John Mallory Phillips, and some other members who became the board of directors. They pooled their money. All of these are African-American businessmen. Mm-hmm. Put it in a little bit of a context, Hampton has since the Civil War been a town with two vibrant and thriving economies. Sometimes they overlapped, sometimes they did not. But there was a very successful business class of African Americans in Hampton since the Civil War. To take a real kind of jag to the side, Hampton is where the contraband camps happened during the Civil War. Contraband being the enslaved people who came to seek their freedom. They set up homesteads and businesses in Hampton after the war, and became quite successful. John Mallory Phillips was what we locally call an oyster baron. Oysters were the commodity that Hamptonians got rich from, and he got quite rich from it. So he was one of these group of people who pooled their money, $15,000. They bought the property and developed a small four-room cottage, which was then put to use, like I described earlier, mostly by Hampton Institute faculty and students and visitors to Hampton Institute. It began to grow from there.
Okay. Well, I know that for African American beaches and resorts, the one thing that I noticed is that it was always either a Black family or a Black business that was owning them.
Yes.
Sparrow Beach was owned by a Black woman, if I'm not mistaken, and she did something very similar to Idlewild. Not as good as Idlewild, because Idlewild was just the place to be. That's where the celebrities would go, and just everybody would just be there. But she had her own thing that she did for a very long time, and that beach is in Maryland. It was two beaches, Sparrow and Caro, or something like that.
Well, Hampton had the benefit of having this business class with means, and the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute as kind of the cornerstones of the African American economy in Hampton. You had an entire staff of a major, we would call it a university, we do call it a university now, who are paid that kind of salary, that kind of income. And they created their own economies. For example, most of these same men founded People's Bank, which was a savings and loan that worked with the African American community almost entirely. You make your own institutions when you're trying to empower yourself, and that's what they did in Hampton. And Bayshore is a wonderful example of how that worked out. The Bayshore Corporation was a corporation, again, founded by African American investors, and was owned by them and run by a board of African American directors.
So my question is, how easy of a process was it for them, given the times, given the legal constraints, how easy was that for them to achieve?
I found in none of my research that there was any significant resistance. They bought the property. Hampton, again, because of the status of the individuals who are the founders and the status of Hampton Institute, I don't think they found the same kind of resistance you might have found in other communities. And again, they could turn to their own institutions to borrow money. They could turn to their own companies and to do the work, the infrastructural work. Again, one of the reasons it succeeded was Hampton had a strong business community here.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'm curious about was, because I can imagine, enjoying the beach the way that we do today in a modern context is a relatively new thing.
It is.
And was the process of obtaining a beach the same no matter what someone's race or ethnicity was? Or was there a difference?
Again, I don't have any specific anecdotes that describe how, for example, it was possible to purchase the property for Bayshore compared to the property that was purchased for Buck Road. But I do know that the tail attached to it was the folks who owned that stretch of beach were net fishermen, and that industry was not paying off. So they were looking to get out. They were looking to sell property. And the unconfirmed tale here is that the Caucasian woman who sold Bayshore property to the investment group, did it out of spite to our neighbors. That is an unconfirmed oral history, but the way I approach my profession is sometimes the story has more truth to it than cold facts.
You're right about that. You're definitely right about that. I just find it, the one thing that bothers me about this whole thing is that every time you talk about a black beach, like Cecilia Queen, she corrected my what I said about it was Sparrows, but it's Car Beach. She said the beaches were Sparrows and Car Beach, owned by two sisters. Their dad bought the beaches and gave them to his daughters. But the thing is that we were, we were always trying to create our own to make things better, and something would always happen and they would take it away. And yet we get these folks that come and say things like we want something for nothing. Well, when we were doing something for ourselves, you didn't want us to have it.
That is that is the unhappy ending that I was alluding to, that all too often comes. Again, the irony, the kind of twin ironies of how Bayshore was able to be created and find great success, and then end was, the Segregation Acts in Virginia in 1912 created an environment where it was both necessary and profitable, and then the Desegregation Acts of 1964 created an environment where it was illegal to segregate, but the profit margin was then made very thin. So with options, other options, African American folks, I think, rightly enjoyed whatever they chose. The unfortunate result was that a lot of the historically Black institutions that had thrived on the necessity that segregation posed to them couldn't survive without that kind of fixed given audience, patron and set of patrons. So, but it's interesting. I almost named our exhibit "The Fence in the Water" because in 1912, the two beaches, the Bayshore and Buckrow, existed. They literally adjoin each other. It's just a property line. And until 1912, they were segregated, but informally. After 1912, they literally built a fence from the far side of the dunes out into as far as they could reach for low tide. And now there was a literal physical barrier that prevented you from crossing over, going from one to the other.
So I'm curious about that. So were there issues, or they just did it because they could build the wall?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question.
Was there an issue between the two beaches having an informal barrier? Was that informal barrier being
I've not found any evidence of that. I've not found any evidence. I think the kind of line was just there, and folks kind of paid attention to it. But with the laws, anyone who wanted to enforce the segregation now had the weight of the state behind them, and then it was not the African Americans at Bayshore that built the fence.
I just want to, because the wonderful thing about the way that we do this show is we do get audience members' questions and comments. And there is a good question from Lucretia Sims. She picked up on something that I was mentioning earlier that Al and I were talking about. So, as we've covered, African Americans have always been associated with the water. And her question was, could this lack of knowledge about that relationship with the water, with water connections, were overtaken by a history of working on the plantations? Not all of our ancestors worked in this. That is a really good question, I have to say. I just wanted to preface that with that is an excellent question. But again, not all of our ancestors worked on a plantation. And again, it's that whole Gullah Geechee corridor from South Carolina all the way down to Florida, especially the rice plantations. A lot of the enslaved populations were working on the water. Alan mentioned boatmen. Down in Florida, they were canalmen. All throughout the eastern seaboard, there were Black mariners. There were Black seamen. Some of them were free. Some of them, most of the ones in the South were enslaved. So we always had that relationship with water. I'm just really curious about why that kind of been, I mean, so much of our history, as Donnie has said, has been left out of or intentionally omitted from history books. That just seems a really puzzling one to leave out.
Well, I can only speak to our local environment. We do know that prior to the Civil War, that Hampton had a population of about 40% of the population were African American. Most of that population was enslaved. There was a free Black community as well, but Hampton is waterlocked. We have rivers and water on all sides. There are no plantations in Hampton. So the enslaved people living in Hampton were tradesmen for the most part. So they would have suffered the shackles of being enslaved, but they were not plantation. They weren't working in fields of cotton. They weren't working in fields of rice. That is deeper south and inland Virginia. The coastal communities that would have found, like Charleston was probably very similar to Hampton. The enslaved community there, like here, would have been tradesmen, carpenters, and blacksmiths, and watermen, and pilots. The enslaved were free labor for whatever task you needed during slavery. One of the peculiar kind of characteristics of Hampton was after the Civil War, when Hampton's enslaved were free, they had a different set of skills that allowed them to create value more easily than those who were on plantations. Now, many of the contraband that came to Hampton were fleeing the kind of classical Gone with the Wind plantation slavery. But the very reason that Hampton Institute was founded was there was a need to give the newly emancipated an economic skill set so that they could have a viable life. So Hampton was in many ways a step ahead of some other parts of the South when it came to establishing a prosperous middle class of free Blacks. So Hampton had that advantage. But again, we look back in our history here, and the African Americans enslaved and after slavery worked on the water, because that's what people do here. They work on the water. They're building boats. They're harvesting seafood. They're working in the seafood industry, processing the harvest. So it's all part of our intertwined culture.
Mm-hmm. And another audience member, Denise, asked the question: what about Herbert House, a historic plantation home located in Hampton, Virginia? She's just wondering if that would be classed as a plantation.
Hampton, I don't know how I would have to go back and do some digging to see how that kind of classification of the Herbert House came to be. Can't generate that off the top of my head. Hampton early did have, like, for example, the lands that became the NASA and the Air Force Base here, the NASA institution, were called Sherwood Plantation. Yeah, so yes, they had existed here, but because Hampton is kind of landlocked with the water on all sides, those are unable to grow, and we certainly couldn't grow cotton, and it was small farming. Yes, you might use the term plantation for some of these farms, large farms that did. And people were enslaved in Hampton. Don't mistake that. But it was a different kind of enslavement.
So that sounds kind of like Patrick Henry's Red Hill. That's my ancestor. His home, he had a four-room home. He didn't go, even though he had the money, he didn't go for Monticello. He didn't go for Montpelier. He didn't go for Mount Vernon. He had a very, very modest house. It was still, but it's technically called a plantation, but it's nothing like the plantation house
Yeah,
think
it's a semantic exercise. But when you have, a like Sherwood Plantation, which was 500 acres and had ceased being a functioning plantation even before the Civil War, it just was not economically feasible. The soil exhaustion, to go way back, the crop in this part of Virginia was tobacco. Tobacco exhausts the soil, and all of the great farms and plantations moved inland 150 years before the Civil War for Hampton. So yes, again, there were large farms. 500 acres in our mind now is a very large farm, but a plantation in Mississippi or South Carolina might be 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 acres. So it's a difference of scale, and the difference being, did they have 10 or 15 enslaved workers on their farm, or did they have 800? It's a matter of scale and definition, but that's a very good point. That's a very good point.
True. So cycling back to the beaches, I'm curious, has there been any studies done on how much revenue they generated for their local community and for the state or county?
That is I can say that I didn't take the time to do it myself, and I don't believe that it has been definitively answered. I do know that in its greatest, in its periods of greatest success, Bayshore was a profit generator. For example, between 1912 and 1933, there were profits ample enough to repay the investors and to grow immensely. For example, the 4-room cottage that it started with became a 70-room hotel of great amenity. It was a wonderful hotel with a bathhouse and a dance hall, balconies on all the rooms that faced the Chesapeake Bay. It was a destination. They built an amusement park. There were clubs and restaurants. So there was enough revenue generated to make the investor group make it profitable for them, but also to grow the business. It ran into an unfortunate reality of nature in 33. A hurricane. We live on the coast. Hurricanes will do their worst. So, but yeah, like era of growth, 1912 to 1933, even, and this is one of the things I discovered, was that even during the Great Depression, from 1929 until the hurricane did its damage in 33, Bayshore was still profitable. It did not go in debt. It did not lose money. And it was still a popular destination.
And then presuming, oh, go ahead, Tanya.
Can you tell us about, well, after Brian asks his question, I'll ask mine because it may be going different directions.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm still sticking with the kind of business side. So presumably, because again, this is land, it's real estate, even though it's used for leisure, I'm presuming taxes had to be paid.
That is one of those sticky issues that came back. It was a revenue generator for the city of Hampton, which may be why it received a little more leeway than it might have otherwise. Toward the end, the city, Hampton made some I would call them public works improvements. along the beach, which reclassified the real estate taxes on the property, which made it very difficult to succeed in a reduced profitability environment. That is a really long way of getting around. They got nailed by the taxes because they did minor improvements along the shoreline, and without the after 1964, they were just unable to generate the profits necessary to keep up with both making money and keeping the property solvent.
Wow.
So yes, there was a taxing issue.
So what is some of the things? Tell us about your particular the Hampton History's what is it called again? Hey, when my mind goes blank. just about your project that's in the museum.
Okay.
Like, tell us about it.
So that there are times in this profession where things arise organically, and you'll hear me use that term over and over again because I don't like forcing an issue. I like finding allies that I can work with and I can learn from. That, you know, as a curator, you are not a core historian. You're a translator. You're a storyteller. You have to be willing to learn. We have since well before I got here, annually hosted an event here, a weekend event called Bayshore Memories. And this is put on by a local collector named Reginald Robinson, who has collected Bayshore memorabilia and stories and documents and photographs his entire adult life. And his fascination with Bayshore, because his family would come from Richmond on the trains. There was a train dedicated from Richmond that came to Hampton, just to Bayshore. He became so fascinated with it that he developed this wonderful collection. We hosted them annually. It first started as an evening event, then it expanded into a weekend event, and then it became him putting on displays throughout the museum. And while we were doing that, we thought, well, while we're hosting our Bayshore Memories, let's see what else we can do to bolster that event. So we looked around and we found an exhibit on black beaches from the Museum of the Albemarle in North Carolina. And I have my connections in North Carolina, so we agreed to host that exhibit here in conjunction with the Bayshore Memories event. Well, it became very early. I determined, I saw that they did not include Bayshore in their interpretation, so we had to do something to tell the Bayshore story. It became a permanent part of this exhibit. And then it just kind of grew together. I was learning from Reginald, and I was seeing how the two stories knitted together, and what started as a supplement to a borrowed exhibit became the development of an exhibit that is 3/4 of the gallery. And it is primarily this telling of the stories that we could identify on how Bayshore was created, how it thrived, how it ran into the steamroller of the hurricane. It came into being again, had a wonderful run of success, and then kind of died under the weight of all of those economic stressors in the 1970s. But we also had this wonderful collection of photographs that I could get from Hampton University. We had a nice collection of images in our museum collection and from Reginald. And then we got Reginald to buy in, not only in helping us understand the story, but to lending us his collection. So while the History Museum has a collection of half a dozen Bayshore related artifacts, and all of them are tabletop size artifacts, Reginald had this warehouse full of artifacts. So it made this wonderful convergence of efforts that we found an ally to work with who is very kind to us as an institution. It allowed us to learn and kind of pass forward that story. So here we are with a full 1,800 square foot gallery filled with this storytelling. And we'll be hosting in September the Bayshore Memories again. Will be kind of the bookend of the duration of this exhibit.
We will definitely have to check that out.
Please do come pay us a visit. The exhibit will be open until the 1st of October.
So do you
And
have other beaches?
Hampton's only African American beach is Bayshore, but the Museum of the Albemarle Beach, for example, it focuses on Seaview Beach, which is just across the Great Water here in Norfolk. It was pretty much right on the coastline where Norfolk joins Virginia Beach. It was also a thriving and successful business until it was bought out. And there are these beaches along the Bogues Beach, Shawan Beach, all these beaches along the rivers and sounds in northeast North Carolina are featured in that part of the exhibit. So, but we really do. I mean, our component really focused in on Bayshore because that's our beach. One of the interesting things I found, and they found as well when they were doing their research, is like every other part of Hampton Roads in 1920, 1930, and 1950, if you lived in Hampton, you did not go to Norfolk. If you lived in Norfolk, you did not go to. It was easier to get to Raleigh than it was to get to Hampton from Norfolk. So because that water was a true barrier, there were ferries, but until they built the bridge tunnels in the late 1950s and then again in the 1960s to expand all that, they were really two different metropolitan areas. They joined together. So Seaview kind of followed the same arc as I think Seaview, from my understanding, was a little bit more posh, as one might expect from a community in Norfolk that was more affluent than the one in Hampton. Had nicer buildings, but it too found an end, and that part of Norfolk, Virginia Beach is now developed and under completely different uses.
Mhm. And again, just to remind the audience, this was nationwide. This wasn't just a Southern thing. When we were in the green room, I was mentioning about the segregated beaches of Boston in the 1973 Revere Beach race riot, because African Americans had the audacity to kind of turn up. So that was interesting. There was also the story that I wasn't even aware of this history. It was in Los Angeles, where a Black family had for generations owned and operated a Black beach, which LA seized under eminent domain. And as a matter of fact, they just settled out of court generations later. And the land was returned to them, plus they got some money for that. But you were kind of talking about the sad demise of African American beaches. And I was just wondering, did eminent domain play a part of that? You've already mentioned about one beach because of closing in the 70s because of financial issues. Kind of what really did lead to some of their closures?
I don't have an example of literal eminent domain being used to seize the properties. There were less dramatic methods. Bayshore found its first end in 1933 when the hurricane came through and destroyed Bayshore and Buckrow Beach. They applied for funding from the Works Programs Administration to rebuild an estimated $30,000 worth of damage, and were only granted 15. So they were not able to, while Buckrow was granted a more generous amount of money. So there was a component in that first disaster that probably speaks to race. They were not treated as well as the other needs. So they were underfunded and were not able to fully return to their original kind of glory. The original hotel, the 70-room hotel, was only 8 years old when the hurricane destroyed it. They couldn't build a hotel back. They built back the dance hall because that was the kind of the most they could get done with the money they had. Then World War II started, and all construction that was not war related was more or less put on hiatus. So, but the new Bayshore Corporation was incorporated in 1940, I believe, 1940, 41, and kind of began operations in a modest way. Then after the war expanded by 1947, they'd rebuilt a hotel there, and they began to rebuild an amusement park. It became a wonderful, wonderful story there. Became a stop on the Chitlin circuit, and the music that came through Hampton to Bayshore was second to none for the time. But then, so they had this from 1947 to 1964, 65, 66. It was really a thriving, going concern. But after desegregation, the profit margin thinned. They had to take out loans to make ends meet. These loans were mostly administered through the Small Business Administration. By 1973, 74, it was clear it was not going to be a profitable concern anymore. The Small Business Administration called them on the loans, seized the property. So again, there was no eminent domain there, but the result was and one of the reasons I mentioned that it became less profitable. Not only was there a smaller, like the hotel was smaller, although the amusement park was much larger, so it kind of shifted focus. But government built a seawall, which was absolutely necessary. It ran through Bayshore, Buckrow, all along the coastline there, kind of to manage the fear of the damage that a hurricane could provide there. But that changed their property values. So the tax rate went up. So the profit margin decreased even more. So Small Business Administration seized the property for the unpaid back loans. It was then turned over to the city of Hampton in 1978 and then sold to a private developer. The land, the beachfront that was Bayshore is now a private condominium development with a private beach. Buckrow still exists right there from that fence that was in the water. North Buckrow is now a city park.
Well,
do the people in the condominiums, do they know the history of where they live?
I have not approached them. I'm going to I'm going to guess that they don't want to know, but I am just guessing. I am putting words in people's mouth. I am making judgments. I know no people that live in that development. Let's also assume that, given humanity the benefit of the doubt, they're good, decent people and have been. But it was an unhappy and if you ask my personal opinion, an unjust ending to a really kind of wonderful story.
Because actually, when you were mentioning the Chitlin circuit, it was a very smooth segue into my next question, which was, what did these places mean to the local? I guess I was going to say the local community, but to African Americans, because you were saying, these were being advertised in the Green Book. People were reading about it in the Green Book and coming. So, what did it mean to them?
It was their place. There is a charm, there is a fulfillment into knowing that your money, your attention, your happiness is going to support your own institutions. And it's just a wonderful thing that you can seize control. I think that is the most important issue. Is this is a point where the folks who created it and the folks who used the beach were in control of their own outcomes. You can't underestimate the importance to the psyche of having control of their outcomes and not surrendering that to some other group that might not wish you well. They'd like your money, but they might not wish you well.
So, because again, I'm thinking about, again, in terms of supporting the community, at least during the peak tourist season, is the beach would also be an employer. I mean, you just mentioned a massive hotel. Well, the hotel wasn't empty. It had cooks and people to wash the dishes and change the sheets and make sure everything ran smoothly, and administrators and all of that. So when you lose the beach, you also lose all of that.
You did. That was an industry that died. Bayshore met its end not so long afterwards. Bayshore ceased being a profitable concern in the 1980s, early 1980s. So there's about a 10-year gap. But that kind of a real kind of aside. We had this beach culture that evolved in the early part of the 20th century, which was kind of slow taking off and then became very, very popular. The Chesapeake Bay beaches in general suffered. Once the bridge tunnels were opened, you could now go to an Atlantic beach, and you were actually on a beach with salt water and waves and broad white sand instead of brackish water with no waves, and a wonderful environment that it was. But to go on down, what was an insurmountable barrier to cross, 20 years earlier now was easily done. A day trip could take you to Virginia Beach.
Mhm.
But the whole kind of coastal amusement park, Chesapeake Bay beach culture, they all suffered. They all suffered from the way we can get from one place to the other.
So it seems to me that after the civil rights laws were passed, every time we now could be a part of stuff. So instead of us supporting our own, we wanted so desperately to go and be accepted into those other establishments. Do you see that?
I think there is a very strong case to be made that that the unintended consequence of that era was to irreparably damage some African American businesses, and unfortunately, what happened during this period in the late 60s, early 70s through the early 80s was a lot of the properties were defaulted on, and property that had been in a family or a business for decades was transferred over to other ownership. And one of the things we talk about as historians a lot is generational wealth. If you can't accumulate generational wealth, you're always going to have a hard time succeeding. Transitioning from working class to middle class, and from middle class to wealth. Generational wealth is really hard to transfer, and became harder to transfer during this era. That is the sad unintended consequence of desegregation.
It's just so much that Black people need to know about themselves, about their families, about what they went through. If they knew those things, would we be where we are today, or would we start back trying to create those Black Wall Streets like they were before? And will those Black Wall Streets continue to exist, or will they be attacked again? Because it's like every time we're in a midst where we're doing something for ourselves, something happens every time. So it's just really I don't know, when I look and I think about these Black beach resorts, Black beaches, Black resorts, what they offered the same exact thing as the other, beaches, or the white beaches, if that's what we're going to call them. But they couldn't last because something always happened. I don't know. I'm just glad we are where we are today to a certain degree, but I kind of want us to be in that era, where in that space where we can work together and make these things happen for us. Because make no mistake about it, just like we ended up moving in the direction of, or trying to be accepted by, those who were not Black, they will do the same thing with us. They have done it. They do it, as far as our music and everything, all of this, all of the things that we do, they're going to do that. So why not build out in that manner? Why not have a beach like that? Can you call it a black beach? Probably not, because then everybody's going to say you're being racist. But, just have that ownership of something like that again.
But I think, if I could just jump in really quick, sorry, Alan,
No, go ahead.
I think non-African Americans still don't understand our psychological need for our own space. Why historically that's a comfort for us. So that is when you get people citing reverse racism. They're like, well, if White Beach said that it was a white beach, then we'd be accused of being racist. We don't understand why Black people need to have their own beaches, but that's because they don't understand our history, they don't understand our trauma, and they don't understand the trauma that's actually in our DNA.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a partial answer to your question. That's my thought.
Okay. Yeah, it's a lot to me.
Yeah. Again, I think it's just so important to feel that that control of destiny and to surrender it as little as possible. And all too often we have to work together to make that happen. But I agree. I'm gonna step on the dangerous ground here, but it's when the Black Lives Matter protests were going about, those folks who felt compelled to somehow or other diminish that movement by trying to wrap it up into this bigger idea of all lives matter. How can you say Black Lives Matter when all lives matter? Well, indeed, all lives are valuable, but this is a specific need, and folks are seeking to address that specific need. Don't begrudge us that.
And you're right, Alan, because it's like a knee-jerk reaction. And a lot of that is because not all of American history, and it's not just African Americans, it's Native Americans, it's Spanish-speaking peoples from all across the southern states up into the Sierra Nevadas. It's not taught. So Americans in general just don't get the kind of historical struggles and issues that sometimes you need your own space. And again, to also answer Danya's question, there are men who complain about women wanting to have their own institutions, clubs, or like, well, what that's reverse sexism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a lack of understanding of what oppressed people have gone through.
And that's why we do this show. That's exactly why we do this show, to introduce and give you a broader broader aspect of what else we did, what else we were capable of, what else we weren't just enslaved people that were brought here, and all of a sudden, that's what this whole series is about. It's about talking about what it is that we did, how we did it, and what happened after the fact. And sadly, the ending is always somewhere kind of the same, but it's there. And if this kind of history is passed out and passed on to others, and they know, well, oh, I didn't even know that so and so did a beach, that we had black beaches back in the day, or whatever the case may be. Maybe I can recreate that. They need to know that we did more. And I appreciate you so much for being on the show and really just talking about, Black beaches as a whole, but particularly the Black beach in Hampton. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And I would just quickly say that when you look at your history and there is a gap, there is something that has interfered with your arc of justice, it is important to be able to go back and pick up that thread before the break. And that's what history can do for you. Be able to go back and draw on the inspiration of the success of folks who may have been your ancestors 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, and know that that is your heritage as well.
And in the final kind of seconds, I'm going to say thank you, everyone who have shared links to Black beaches, because I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, Yeah, that was I knew about the one for Black Pass. That one I've seen before, but it's amazing. But yeah, once again, we do thank you for being on the
Thank
show.
you for having me.
Yes,
I've
it's
enjoyed
been
it.
wonderful. Next week, next Sunday, we are hoping to round it, kind of move into Black universities as colleges. That's our next step.
Mhm.
So we're going to talk about that, what they did, how they came about, stuff like that.
Well, we have
So
a very good one right here in Hampton.
true. So thank you, Alan, for dropping your knowledge and for your passion in this project. Thank you, everyone who's spent the last hour with us. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. You guys have a great day.
Have a great one.